Around the world, governments are in the business of decarbonizing their electricity systems, trying to get to net zero by 2050. And some of them, like Canada, have decided they want to do it by 2035, except for Ontario, which it seems determined to actually increase its GHG emissions from its electricity system, according to a new report out from the independent electricity system operator. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Mark Winfield at York University about that. Welcome to the interview, Mark.
Good afternoon, Markham.
Why is Ontario going backwards?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And we don't seem to have a very good explanation. It seems that the province, one way or another, has maneuvered itself into this position where it's effectively taken all the alternatives off the table. I mean, there's a combination of things going on. It's the taking out of service of nuclear units at Darlington and Bruce, which needs to be recovered. Pickering needs to retire. It should have retired already. And they are now beginning to contemplate the possibility that there could be some increase in electricity demand if electrification happens. But the province also seems to have systemically taken the alternatives off the table. It refuses to talk about renewables. It dismantled its own strategy around efficiency, and it refuses to talk to Quebec. So the only alternative it seems to have left itself with is to run up the fleet of natural gas-fired generation, which already exists, but has been relatively lightly used up to now.
So the IESO report provided us with some guidance on what they think greenhouse gas emissions will be thanks to natural gas-fired generation. Can you share those with us, please?
Well, the projection now is about 375% increase in electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions out to 2030, and over 600% increase, so a 6 times increase out to 2040. And disturbingly, if you look at the curve, it appears to be continuing on upwards beyond there. So we're looking at a situation where they're projecting natural gas-fired generation, which recently has been down around 2-3% of total output because it's really just being used for balancing, going up to 19% by 2030 and 25% of generation by 2040, which is basically the same portion that coal was before we phased it out in 2013. So we do seem to be going backwards in a fairly dramatic way, because often these conversations about decarbonization, electrification, well, one of the places you start, you decarbonize your electricity system first, because you're going to need it to help you with electrification and transportation and spacing and other things. We seem to be on a somewhat different trajectory.
Now, the federal government and Prime Minister Trudeau have been talking a lot in recent years about decarbonizing the electricity system and Canada meeting its 2030 climate targets. In fact, they were increased from 30% over 2005 levels to 40 or 45%. So that is the Ontario's strategy here is not compatible with federal policy, and the federal government does have regulatory tools at its disposal to force Ontario to lower its emissions. It's got the Canada Greenhouse Gas Act, it's got the Canadian Environmental Protection Act that it's used to take coal out of the system. Do you think that it will use those tools to force Ontario to cut back on its natural gas generation?
Well, this is an interesting question, because there is now a commitment out there to decarbonize the electricity sector, get to net zero by 2035. And presumably the intended tools are that something like the regulatory sort of structure that's been used around coal is an obvious possibility. In the shorter term, of course, they could also start charging natural gas the full freight in terms of carbon pricing, as opposed to treating it under the output-based pricing system for industrial emitters. That would start to move in those directions as well. But yes, it would seem to set up a confrontation with Ontario with its intention to rely very heavily on its natural gas fleet to get it, not only get it through the nuclear refurbishment period, but it's now becoming clear this seems to be how they intend to deal with future demand as well. Now there is precedent in the past. I mean, around the coal phase out in particular, the federal government did at one point threaten to regulate emissions under the ozone annex with the United States. At that point, this was now 20 years ago, but that was one of the things that pushed the coal phase out in Ontario over the top, was the threat of federal regulation in the background. So in theory, at least, it would seem this is certainly, I don't know how, to put it another way, I don't know how much Trudeau is going to get to where he wants to get to in the electricity sector without confronting this situation in Ontario. Eventually this issue is going to come up in Alberta and other places as well that have moved to gas, but Ontario is unusual, that we're very clearly on a trajectory that anticipates a large, very large increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector during the critical period in which we're aiming to be moving both to achieve now the Glasgow target, but also a net zero target as well.
Now, there's another angle to this we haven't talked about a lot, and that is that the low cost of natural gas-fired electricity has only been enabled by the fact that gas prices were down around, $2.50 a gigajoule, sorry. And those are going up. I mean, we're seeing them now up at $6 and $7. And the oil companies are talking about how they're having trouble reinvesting in new production. They're expecting oil and gas prices to stay high all throughout the 2020s. And so I can see a scenario in which Ontario says, oh yeah, we're just going to ramp up natural gas generation, only now the fuel is 2 or 3 times as costly, and that will have a negative effect and an unpleasant effect on consumers' electricity bills.
That part of the equation does not seem to have been fully accounted for by the IESO or the province. That yes, we know natural gas prices after historic relatively low levels are now definitely moving upwards. And that doesn't seem to be taken into account in this conversation. One wonders, particularly given the Ford government's commitments, and we're heading into an election as well, to keep electricity prices under control. That's going to become very, very challenging if natural gas prices begin to move upwards significantly. And yet, so far, the Ford government continues to have an allergy to anything involving the word renewable. There is no movement on energy efficiency. And despite the fact that Quebec has run into yet more problems trying to export to the United States, there seems to be no interest in a conversation with Monsieur Legault. So as we've discussed before, where Ontario goes from here goes into the good question category.
Well, let's wrap up this conversation with one follow-up on a point you made earlier, Mark, about the carbon tax and the output-based pricing system, which basically, I don't think a lot of people understand that when it comes to industrial emitters like utilities, they actually get an 80 or 90% discount on the carbon tax. So if you've got a $50 a ton carbon tax and you're getting a 90% discount, you're only paying $5. And I would imagine that if Prime Minister Trudeau abandoned that for Ontario and suddenly they had to pay the full freight, natural gas might not be nearly as attractive.
Well, that in combination with a rising base price, I think could have a significant impact on this equation. As you say, at the moment, natural gas-fired generation is treated as an industrial source. So they're only paying the carbon price and their emissions over a sectoral average, as opposed to on all of the natural gas they're burning. So if they had to pay the same way, well, I do in Ontario, where we pay, or effectively Enbridge pays and it adds it to our gas bill, the full freight in terms of the carbon impact of the natural gas that's being burned in my furnace at $50 a ton and going upwards, yes, that would fundamentally alter the equation in terms of the cost of natural gas-fired generation. And again, would push the province to have to think about alternatives. At the moment, the only thing it's shown any interest in is a small modular reactor, which OPG announced for Darlington, or at least announced they want to go with a particular design or a particular manufacturer at Darlington. But that's not going to help in the short term. And so, I think at some point, Ontario will be forced to enter into a conversation about what is it going to do, both because of the market increase in natural gas prices, but also, if the federal government does decide to take a more aggressive approach to carbon pricing around gas-fired generation, that clearly is going to change the equation significantly.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Markham.